Today I thought we might look at a technique for voicing jazz chords. So just imagine that you've written a really nice jazz melody and you've found a couple of chords underneath that are going to give good support to that melody, but what you really want to do is voice those chords for the piano or maybe even a horn section or a saxophone section. So how do we go about voicing those chords? You can even use this technique when you're doing an arrangement of an existing song. So if you pick out a jazz standard and you've got the chord progression sorted out, how do you voice the chords for the instruments that you want to use? So today I'm going to show you a technique that you can use to voice them for the instrumentation of your choice. So here I've set out 4 jazz chords, and I think we'll only use 4 because once you see the technique work on these 4 chords, you'll be able to apply the technique to any chord progression that you really want to use. So I've picked 4 chords. The first one being C minor 7, second one F7, the next one B flat major 7, and the final one is E flat major 7. This is a very popular chord progression and one that you'll probably encounter in your experiences when you're dealing with jazz music. So if you're unfamiliar with any of the symbols at the top of the page, well, we'll work through those chords now. The first chord has a C, so the bass note will be C. The little m indicates that it's minor, so the triad will be minor. And then the 7, well, if it doesn't specifically say a major 7, then it's a minor 7 for that chord. So we'll have a C minor triad, C, E flat, G, and we'll add the minor 7th on top, which is B flat. Moving on to chord 2, the symbol is a simple F7. The F means the bass note is F, and because there's no little m there, it will be a major triad, which is F, A, C. The 7th is just a 7th. It's not telling us that it's a major 7, so we naturally assume that it's a minor 7th, so we place an E flat, which is the minor 7th of F, on top. The chord is F, A, C, E flat. Moving on to chord 3, B flat, capital M, 7. The B flat means it's a B flat major chord, B flat, D, F, and the capital M7 means we want the 7th to be major. It won't be a minor 7th this time, it will be a major 7th above the bass note B flat. So our 7th will be A natural. The chord itself, B flat, D, F, A natural. And the very final chord, E flat, capital M, 7. So the E flat again means bass note E flat. We build a triad on that note, a major triad, which is E flat, G, B flat. And because of the capital 7, we want to put a major 7th on top of the bass note. A major 7th above E flat is a D natural. So that's it. There's our chords, all spelled out exactly the way that the chord symbols suggest that we build them. But look what happens when I play these chords on the piano. It might sound okay, but can you see how my hand jumps all over the piano just to play these chords? What we really want to do is voice the chords so that we minimize the movement of the hand between the chords. And the way we do this is we identify the most important notes of the chord. Now this is rather interesting because if you look at the first chord, it says C minor 7. You would imagine that C is probably the most important note of that chord. In fact, it isn't. When we're voicing that chord, C is not such an important note because generally that C is really well represented in the bass line on the bass instrument. So what we want is to highlight the most important notes. And in any chord, the third determines whether the chord is major or minor. So that gives it great importance. The third is a really important note. And then the 7th on top determines the dissonance within the chord and also the direction of the chord. It often pushes the chord onto the next chord. So our important notes are the 3rd and the 7th. Armed with this knowledge, we are now going to use the thirds and sevenths and place them on the bottom of the chord. So, if I now revoice the C minor seventh with the third at the bottom, it looks like this. We have an E flat at the base, and I simply just pile the rest of the notes on top. G, B flat, C. And as a general rule, if I base the first chord on the third, I should base the next chord on the other important note, the seventh. Let's see what happens when we build our F7 chord based on the seventh. So the seventh in this chord is an E flat. We're sharing the bottom note. If you look back to the first chord, we're sharing the same note. And then we build the chord on top. E flat, F, A, C. Can you now see how our two chords have such a nice smooth movement between the two? There's no jump anymore, and we're voicing the chords beautifully so that one just progresses on from the other. Let's continue this technique. I've based the F7 chord on the seventh, so the next chord, the B flat major seventh, I'm going to base on the third of the chord. Now the third of B flat major 7 is a D. Can you see how close that is to the E flat of the previous chord? We're really minimizing the movement, and then on top of that D, I just pile the rest of the notes, F, A, and B flat. Moving on to our final chord, I'm going to continue the pattern. So previously, the B flat major 7 chord I based on the third of the chord. So the E flat major 7 chord I'm going to base on the seventh. And the seventh note of that chord is D, and I pile the rest of the notes on top, E flat, G, B flat. Look at the movement between our chords now. I've eliminated all the big jumps from the first version of the chords. I've voiced them in a much more friendly way for the piano player to play, and the progression sounds so much smoother because we've got rid of all the lumps and bumps of those big intervals. Okay, so let's get rid of that version, and just to prove that it can happen the other way, I'm going to start the C minor 7 chord based this time on the seventh. So the seventh of the chord is B flat. Pile the rest of the notes of the chord on top, we get C, E flat, G. That's the first voicing. Moving on to chord 2, the F7. Previous chord was based on the seventh, therefore this chord needs to be based on the third. So I place an A at the base and put the rest of the chord notes on top. So C, E flat, F. We've minimized the movement once again between those two chords. Continuing the process, B flat major 7, our third chord of the progression, I will base now on the seventh, which is an A natural, the rest of the chord notes on top, B flat, D, F. And the final chord, E flat major 7, because the previous chord was built on the seventh, this one gets built on the third, which is a G, the rest of the chord notes on top, B flat, D, E flat. Look at the movement that we have this time. Beautifully smooth, no big jumps, awkward jumps for the piano player or any other instrument for that matter, and the chords are beautifully voiced. I'm going to show you one more trick. Remember earlier when I said the root note of the chord actually isn't the most important note of the chord. It's generally represented by the bass instrument, and when we voice the chord, well, it's not necessary because it's already being sounded by another instrument. So, if we think of that bass note as the 8th note of the scale, not the first, but the 8th. If we push it one step higher, it becomes a 9th. Now the 9th is a really colourful note. So looking at our first chord here, the C minor 7 chord, if I see the C there and bump it one step higher to a D, then the chord becomes C minor 9th, a much more colourful sound. Moving on to chord 2, F7, I highlight the F and I bump it one step higher, it becomes a G, therefore the chord itself is an F7 or F9 chord actually, and it doesn't have an F in it. We're getting rid of the tonic note and we're creating some colour by making it the 9th note of the chord. Moving on to bar 3, B flat major 7, I find the B flat, I move it up one step to a C, suddenly I've got a B flat major 9th chord. Can you see how that works? The final one, E flat major 7, well, I find the E flat, I move it up one step to an F, suddenly that chord becomes an E flat major 9th. We've created some really nice sounds, some colourful sounds, and we've voiced the chords perfectly. Today I've demonstrated all the voicings on the piano, but the same voicings apply if you're writing for a horn section, or a sax quartet, or a trumpet section, or a trombone section. You would voice the chords exactly the same way. Let's look at the first chord. If you're writing for 4 saxophones, your lead alto would play the G, second alto the E flat, first tenor the D, and the B flat at the bottom would be played by the second tenor. You could do the same thing with trumpets or trombones. So, to recap the process, firstly, build all the chords up in root position so you know what notes you're using. Secondly, you then start voicing the chords based on the 3rd and the 7th note of those chords. So if you start with your first chord based on the 3rd, alternate so that the next chord gets built on the 7th. The following one on the 3rd, the next one on the 7th, you just alternate between the two. And finally, once you've done your voicing and you're very happy with the way that the chords move, well then think about voicing for other instruments. You might want to voice it for saxophones, trumpets, trombones, any wind and brass instrument, you will voice exactly the same way.